Hi, this is Paul, and this is round 2 on the conversations around Jordan Peterson and his tweets at the Pope. To the best of our knowledge, the Pope did not respond, and didn't appear that his staff responded either, because it's quite likely his staff manages the papal Twitter account. But Nate was responded to it on Twitter quite a bit, and I talked to Cal Zeldin last week about this, and Nate has continued to bring it up. So I wanted to kind of hear Nate out on it and talk with you about it, Nate. So what grabbed you so much about Jordan Peterson's little papal tweets?
So it wasn't the initial tweet was just kind of like I shrugged at, right? I mean, I'm like, okay, like I think you're not understanding what Catholics mean when they talk about social. I just assumed at first that Peterson just misunderstood what Catholics mean when they talk about social justice.
Okay, so this was the initial tweet, right? There's
yes,
nothing Christian
correct.
about hashtag social
and that
justice.
like everything that Pope Francis says in that tweet can be found in Rerum Novarum. It's standard Catholic social teaching. There's nothing. It has nothing to do with social justice TM, which is neither social nor just, and that I understand Peterson's objections to. And so I just figured it was a misunderstanding. But then there was a very reasonable, conservative Catholic take on it that appeared in the Washington Examiner. And Peterson like retweeted that, or quote tweeted that article, rejecting the idea of authentic social justice entirely.
Okay.
And as far as I'm concerned, like the idea of rejecting the concept of social justice as such is just simply not on the table for Christians. And for Peterson to presume to tell Christians that they ought to reject the concept of social justice as such is pretty rich.
So when you say Peterson rejected social justice as such, what do you mean by that?
Because because in denying the possibility of authentic social justice, that's precisely what you're doing. You're saying that if you're saying there can be no authentic social justice, that means you're rejecting the category of social justice. But justice is inherently social. I can remember like the first time I heard about like I a lot of my friends are way more people of the internet than I am. I am more now, but not naturally. And I can remember in about 2008 or so hearing the term social justice warrior for the first time, and my initial reaction to that was, okay, what's wrong with that? Right. And it's like so I had no conception of the way in which the notion of social justice had been like subverted. So the problem is the subversion of social justice,
right?
But we can't, like, conservatives can't make the move that social justice itself is a bad idea. They have to give a better version of it, because social justice is just part of human life, hopefully.
So I listened to Karen and Gavin Ashenden, their conversation. Did you hear that conversation too?
I didn't get a chance to listen to it yet. I read part of Gavin's article. Like I read about 3 paragraphs of Gavin's article, and then I was like, it was just too, like, you can't, there's this reaction that's like, I understand. It's like, I like Jordan Peterson. I don't think Jordan Peterson is a bad person. But we have to, when he gets something really wrong, we can't be afraid to say, you're getting this really wrong.
Well, I don't think you should be afraid to say that. In fact, I think
I feel like I'm just like, in our world, I feel like I'm one of the few voices saying, I was actually refreshed by, I invited Hank. Hank asked to come on my Catholic panel that I'm putting together on Saturday. And I was actually really refreshed. And I wanted conservative voices on that panel. I did not want it to be like some kind of like a left-leaning only Catholic. So I have quite a diverse group of Catholics that are coming to talk about that. I've got Jordan Daniel Wood, and I've got Hank, and I've got Laura, and I've got Dominic D'Souza from Smart Catholics all coming on. And I'm gonna try to not say anything. I'm going to try to just let them talk, because as an Anglican, it's like I'm kind of an outsider, although I'm a very Catholic-leaning Anglican.
Well, that sounds like a terrific panel. That's coming on when?
That's Saturday.
Saturday, okay. Because that does sound like a terrific panel. Hank, of course, is interesting. And part of what's happening here is there's not only with this this term social justice, which, I had this. I think you and I probably have similar political evolutionary stories in that social justice was never problematic for me for years. Although Tim Keller's been sort of painted with a
I would
particular
think
brush.
it's like as you're kind of informed by Kuiper, right? So I think
Right.
like the idea of someone who's informed by Kuiper, the idea of rejecting social justice as such has to be just like as anathema as I find it.
Right. But it seemed that and I've always been annoyed at sort of the capturing of certain words into a certain political valence, and I saw that as as just sort of a naked grab after this is what social justice means, and you have all of these things, and it's like and part of
but those things though, but thing is, Paul, is all of those things that he put in that like have been part of Catholic social teaching for a very long time. Like literally, you can find every single idea he expressed in that in 1891 in the encyclical Rerum Novarum. Every single principle he expresses there is right there in Rerum Novarum.
Yeah. But the Catholics have also been very interesting on their, and part of the difficulty with talking about Catholic teaching is that it is also enormously broad.
Yes.
And, there's of course, papal encyclicals, but then there's also all of these other Catholics out there who have been teaching things far and wide. And it's part of the difficulty of when I think about the Catholic Church is, okay, what exactly am I supposed to think of? Because it's just simply so massive and it's so old.
Well, even like, let's say like suspicion about liberation theology, even liberation theology is not, it has more than one school.
Yep.
And I think the school of liberation theology that most conservatives find objectionable is the German school, which has a tendency to naturalize the supernatural. But there's a French strain of liberation theology that does the opposite, and it supernaturalizes the natural, which I think is completely valid Catholic theology.
So let's talk a little bit about Twitter and the purpose of Twitter. One of the things that this whole thing sort of, we for a long time, I don't think either you and I are really creatures of the internet so much. I get a lot of my internet stuff now from my audience, from Rick. I mean, Rick will always set me down and say, have you seen this? And it's like, I've never seen that.
Yeah. We're not native. It's not our native habitat, shall we say? Neither one of us.
No, that's true. But part of, there's the literal internet where it's people, there's just sort of one surface. And I think that one surface begets this idea that everyone on the internet should only play things in a very straightforward way. And from what I'm not even going to speculate what on earth Jordan Peterson does on Twitter, because I'm never quite sure, because he's, we've talked about this before. Jordan Peterson on Twitter seems often, not always, like a very different person than Jordan Peterson on stage or on YouTube.
It brings out a certain aspect of his personality is what I think, because there's a certain aspect of Jordan that is hot-headed and reactive.
Yep.
And you can see that in other places too. And Twitter just amplifies that portion of his personality.
Right. It facilitates it. It brings it out. But then there's also this sense of always, because you have such a flat world on the internet where any speech is supposed to be, but this isn't even true because the internet is broad and vast too. People take any speech as simply a pushing of one side of a binary or the other.
Yeah. And
so right away, people are, I'm for it, I'm against it. I mean, it's the internet just gets super flat.
And Peterson already has a tendency to kind of to see particularly on these kinds of issues, to see in a set of binaries that is not Catholic. because Catholic doesn't see in terms of either the individual collective binary that is so important to him, because Catholic theology is inherently personalist, which is neither, right? So he misses that. And then it's also like, if you look at Catholic social teaching, it's not in favor of unfettered capitalism or Marxism. Right? It's just, it thinks that both fail on Christian terms.
Right. And it also, although I sometimes have the sense in listening to some Catholics that they are trying, well, maybe this is just inevitable, that they are trying to instantiate a unique vision of blessedness in the world, but it's almost impossible to not sort of just trigger images of various instantiations, especially at particular times when the Catholic Church seemed to experience more hegemony than it does now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part of that is inevitable, because we can't help but think in pictures to some degree, because when we see something, it's like, okay, that's sort of what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at. You see that with some of this distributism that goes around, integralism. I mean, all of these things,
which are getting stronger because almost everyone, maybe Jordan doesn't, but almost everyone seems to be realizing that liberalism is failing.
Yes.
And I think Jordan wants to save it.
Yes.
And I don't think that the Catholic Church is necessarily invested in saving liberalism in the same way that Jordan is. So there's going to be some conflict there.
No, I think that's very true. I think part of the anxiety, part of why this is, watching you and this is very interesting, is because of course you identify as a Christian anarchist, and you were about the first or second person that I ever saw identify in that way. And when I heard that, I thought, oh, and then of course read a little bit of Ivan Illich and began. And so, and that, you know, especially as I was talking to Cale, and as I continue to think about this impending end of liberalism and modernity, and this deep anxiety about, you know, where to go or what to do, and actually when I was listening to Karen and Gavin's conversation, I thought in some ways, even though Gavin can sometimes just sort of sound like a conservative reactionary who has sort of been through the whole trajectory in his life, because he's had a very interesting life, and to just kind of get old and cranky and angry at all of these ideas that he's sort of been disillusioned by. There is a certain anarchism in his conversation with Karen, which I found very interesting. And
I'll have to listen to it.
Yeah. And it isn't, I don't think he's in any way self-consciously that way. I think when you just hear, you know, he really, I guess, according to Karen told me, she had a lot of ambivalence about posting that conversation, because it sounded like he had come into that conversation just off of a rather antagonistic invitation into another space. So, you know, biologically, he was already
right, because that's the thing, is like this, the groups of people that are upset by this is really diverse and weird, right?
Yes.
Because there are conservative, post-liberal Catholic integralists that are going to be enraged by this just as much as progressive Catholics are enraged by this. So that means that, like, it's a huge group of people.
and the funny thing about Jordan
Some
Peterson,
of whom very much identify as conservatives.
Yes, yes. and that's where, you know, whenever Jordan Peterson comes out as like a conservative, you know, he's always talking about conservatism now. I always listen to him and I think, but are you really? I mean,
No.
what on earth does that term really mean? Is
well,
there
it's
any
like
functionality to it?
It means he's using it with it. I mean, it's perfectly appropriate for him to call himself a conservative within the North American milieu, where conservative just means that you're right liberal, because we only have liberals. Like there are no viable post-liberal political movements or leftist political movements within the United States. Sorry to break it to you, right liberals, but Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. He's just a liberal who favors a welfare state. It's still liberalism.
And I remember I think it was what Ralph Nader said during the Al Gore George W. Bush election. He's like, you know, really? This is, and of course, the media plays it like some huge chasm between them, but
right. But there's massive consensus on almost everything, and there has been for 50 years in both the UK and the United States.
Yeah. No,
we're just liberal. Although the UK does have a stronger post-liberal presence. Like D.C. Schindler is about the only like major American post-liberal thinker I can come up with off the top of my head. Maybe Connor Cunningham. Well, no, he's not American, so never mind. Yeah, so D.C. Schindler is pretty much it.
So,
and I would say Tucker Carlson amongst conservatives like has like this like just like this sort of like the barest beginnings of post-liberal instincts, I would say, but still not quite.
But I want to get at your anarchism a little bit, because one of the things too that I thought of when I was, I mean, I know for a lot of people on the internet, these conversations that we do are sort of shows, but I suspect that for us, they are not shows as much as we are just trying to work things out with each other. Right. And we found that it's better to work them out often, not always, with the camera on and the comment section up, and because there are a lot of smart people who aren't going to show up on these cameras, and they're putting in good comments. And
also, in my personal experience, I do my best thinking when I have someone pushing back at me. Yeah. Because that's the only way you can discover what you're like the axioms that you haven't recognized.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So it's like, and to be perfectly honest with you, like this whole Peterson thing has kind of like forced me to like I had an exchange with John Milbank about Christian anarchism recently, and Milbank is more of a left post-liberal, Christian socialist type, and he like some of the points that he made to me, like I suddenly had more resonance when I realized how much I was not willing to let go of the concept of social justice as such. It's like, oh, okay, so I would say that I'm kind of leaning like slightly more toward like an anarcho monarchism than an
well, and this is what fascinates me,
because I've always wrestled with good post-liberal thought because it has important things to say, like, and it's worth wrestling with. And I want to question, and I want to question those axioms that I might have that are unexamined, and the things that I might be getting wrong. So, this is sort of like, I would say that like I kind of understand where Pajot is coming from a little bit more now than I did like say 3 months ago.
How so? Flesh that out a little better.
I think. So it's complicated. It's I read this article recently. Actually, it was from Michael Martin's blog. It was a really good interview with Owen Barfield and traditionalists. And there's this concept. I mean, it has to do with, ultimately it comes down to what the proper role of tradition is, right? And so I think that we can't dispense with it entirely, but neither can we have a notion of tradition that merely looks back to the past and romanticizes the past,
right?
Which is what I kind of thought Pajot was doing, and I thought was the root of like why he calls himself a monarchist and why I call myself a Christian anarchist. But I would say that my tendency is to view tradition as related more to final causality, because of the fact that we're still in the process. We're still whatever we are going to be, we're still in the process of becoming.
Right.
So tradition also calls to us from the future because of the pull of that final cause.
Right.
But we still need some sort of continuity of where I think I was kind of getting things wrong is that you can't only have that idea.
Right.
Of tradition calling to you from the future.
Right.
You also it has to be doing it in such a way that you have continuity with the past.
Yeah.
So you need to look in both directions.
And
in order to have the best possible decision making in the present.
And so you don't see Peugeot as just wanting to just go back.
Correct. That was like that was me. And like sometimes like I would go back, like sometimes I would hear him say things that like was like, okay, I can, I would both strongly agree and strongly disagree with him at various times, just depending on what exactly he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that some of the disagreements I now can see were because of me having some axioms that were unexamined.
Mm-hmm.
And the picture was more complicated than what I was seeing.
Okay. I do want to get into this anarchism, especially with respect to, and now you threw what did you say?
An anarcho-monarchism?
Anarcho-monarchism.
Yeah.
That's like black whiteism. What on earth do you mean? Because so when I was having my conversation with Cale Zeldin.
Here's the thing: monarchy is not okay. So I think I now believe the traditionalist argument that monarchy is not a political institution, but it is actually, but monarchy is in fact a sacred symbolic institution.
Okay.
So you can have a monarch that is not political.
Yes. Well, in fact, that has been what's happened to the English monarchy.
Correct.
They've decided to have a non-political monarchy.
Correct.
And part of what happens in the American system is you have presidents that have certain monarchical aspects and political aspects. And because it's all in one person in one office, it's always sort of mixed up together sometimes for good and sometimes for bad.
But my orientation still remains fundamentally like localist.
Well, and that's where sort of it was interesting listening to Gavin Ashenden in this, where there's definitely a strain of that in some American evangelicals too.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of where it's interesting, where Karen and Gavin sort of found each other's, they're working their way through. But again, when I was talking to Cale and I was thinking about, the idea that the Pope sits on the throne of Christ, and so Gavin Ashenden, of course, he's been all sorts of things throughout his life. He was an Anglican. He was then one of the little cluster of priests.
He's kind of ruling in absentia, though. He's not like, it's not really, it's like he's like a viceroy more than he is. You know what I'm saying? So it's like it's not that he is, it's that he operates in lieu of.
Yes.
Within the earthly realm.
Yes. But is he political? And what on earth do we mean by that question?
Right.
Because in some ways, that's also whatever's in Jordan's brain when he's going after that. That's also, I think, an implicit reading of his attack on the Pope. And what was so interesting about Gavin's conversation with Karen is that on one hand, Gavin can be known for someone who gets all upset about, he's one of these clergy that gets political because he wants to talk about transgender stuff and wokeism and all of that. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, when he's talking about Karen, he's basically saying that the Pope shouldn't be political. And so when I hear that, I think we've really got to talk about these definitions and what we're meaning by these words, such as political.
Right.
And that very much gets into this idea of, very much what Gavin is reacting to with Karen is and I know I've got you at a disadvantage because you haven't heard it, but he doesn't say anything in there you haven't heard before, except for a few stories.
The question is what do we mean when we say political, right?
Right.
So this is the thing, and I would say that in the past, I operated under a definition of political that would be that politics is the science of power, and that's what I think it really is, or what I thought it really is. But I would say that people who would argue for a Christian notion of social justice or political theology are operating under the assumption under a definition of the political that is far broader, which would render the political something that is inevitable, an inevitable human concern. And if that's the case, then we have no choice but to concern ourselves with things like social justice and political theology.
So I work as a communicator, as a pastor. I spend an inordinate amount of time asking myself, you would never know this from my channel, before the words leave my mouth, how are they going to be heard? In many ways, that's what preachers are really concerned with, because in terms of at least a good amount of our job, the pastoral job, there's certainly an aspect of that. But in terms of preaching, that makes words and the choice of words a very big part of our focus. And when I listened to the sentences you just made, I just heard them being understood by many different people in many different ways, which brings me to the question, okay, well,
because we mean different things when we use that term political.
Yes, we do.
Really do.
We do.
And so I had previously been a person who held to a more narrow definition of the political, because I don't think it's fair to call any form of human social. I did not think it was fair to call. I actually got in an argument with David Bentley Hart about this through email. Because I saw him using a definition of political as like any form of human social organization whatsoever as political. And to me, that seems like overbroad.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that it is. And I'm especially not sure, and it does bear mentioning that the image that we have of the eschaton is a city. But at the same time, the church is something other than the polis, I would say.
Yes.
So, and that was the primary thing that informed my Christian anarchism, is like the church, whatever the church is something, it's an alternative to the polis. So for us to, as Christians, be overly concerned with the affairs of secular government and politics is a distraction from the mission of the church.
A la Acts 6 in some ways.
Correct. Yeah, right. But it turns out that things are way more complicated than I was making them.
Well, and this question is, it runs through the Bible in the sense that in the Old Testament you have the focus of concern is sometimes on, let's say, individual clans. Let's think of the patriarchs in Genesis, but very quickly the focus of concern is on what today. Even grasping at these, talking about how on earth we would categorize today the Old Testament nation of Israel. Is it a family? Is it a clan? Is it a kin group? And right away those tensions come out in the book of Exodus, where you have the mixed multitude. They come up and they sort of are gathered into Israel. But the focus is, of course, on, much of the Old Testament. You have the kings and the prophets. And right there, you have this tension in some ways, this proto tension between what will eventually be the church and state. And even though those alignments aren't right, these tensions just remain within Christianity. And you see them, Tom Holland, of course, in Dominion writes about them a lot in terms of, showdowns between popes and emperors. Of course, in Protestantism, one of the lenses through which to view Protestantism, and hence its child liberalism, is the attempt to navigate this tension that you just described between church and polis. And of course, Calvin in Geneva is working on that, and some of the ways he comes to relate.
I would say that liberalism's roots are not exclusive. This is where it gets. Okay, I'm going to make it even more complicated. This is where, when it comes from people who come out of like the Anglosphere of the West, for English-speaking peoples, liberalism is actually far older than the Protestant Reformation.
True, because
like Germanic peoples have had democratic localist governments as long as there have been Germanic peoples. So this would be true of like most of us who are of Northern European ancestry in North America, like some sort of liberal democratic principles go as far back as you can go. And it was the norm for Germanic tribes was elected kingship.
Interesting.
So there's a way in which for the Anglosphere, liberalism is not completely disconnected from tradition, because its roots are so deep. There's like, so for example, Thomas Jefferson, like before 1920 in America, the American view of the American was as more English than the English.
Yes.
And Thomas Jefferson wanted to put Hengist and Horsa on the seal for the United States of America. So symbolism happens.
Yes.
So this is a clear indication that there's something about the democratic experiment here that is related to very ancient traditions, in fact, of the ancestors of the English-speaking people. And it's hard not to see. I mean, George Washington is a king in all but name. Yeah. And effectively an elected king.
Yeah. Who at least via tradition, a very reluctant king.
But that's part of the, I think, but this comes in that, that idea of reluctant kingships. This is part of the pattern, right? This is a repeated pattern in our culture that it has biblical roots in sort of the Davidic model, because David doesn't want to be king. He's chosen by God to be king.
Yep.
Right. And you can see this also like I'm Grail country, so I have to bring up that this is also part of Arthurian legend, right? Arthur doesn't know that he is the rightful king, has no desire to be king, and is chosen by God to be king by pulling the sword from the stone.
Right.
So like this is actually the ideal, our cultural ideal of kingship is someone who has no desire to be king, but is chosen by God to be king anyway.
Right. See, so another thing that happened when I was talking to Kale was I was thinking about you before I set it up with Kale, but I thought I first want to talk to Kale, and I do want to talk to Nate. And part of it is
Kale's great. I enjoyed that conversation, and I like Kale.
Part of and your ideas of anarchy, or at least this sort of because anarchy can just mean sort of pure chaos, but that's certainly not what you mean.
No, I'm not. I'm talking more like the kind of Christian anarchism I'm talking about is best reflected historically by the Anabaptist communities, which are, and if anyone wants to say that anarchism is not stable or viable, I would submit to you that these communities have been going strong for over 500 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a really helpful definition, because I think when I think about post-liberalism, what comes after liberalism, and why in the United States, for example, I think people don't appreciate how radical an experiment the United States was, in the sense of there were at least initially state churches in the states. Massachusetts was the last state to give up its state church. The American system is, I think, to some degree, has a degree of anarchy within it. I think all democratic models do, in that they there isn't, you don't hold at the center let's say, a pope or a monarch or a church, you have a bit more chaotic. You have more of a chaotic center, and that's what makes the American.
Yeah, there's this fundamental desire not to be arbitrarily ruled by people who are far away. Is the simplest way I can put it. You can kind of like, and you can see this like in the history, like this is kind of what's going on. I mean, yeah, obviously it's about slavery, but that's also kind of what's going on with the Civil War.
Yep. Oh yeah.
It's like, like you can't arbitrarily rule us from far away. You're not here. You don't know what's going on with us. You don't have the right to tell us what to do in our land.
Yeah. But the challenge, of course, in the world, especially the world when these great empires would emerge, is that, even in the book of Daniel, the beasts that arise out of the sea are these empires, and what they do is they gobble up little kingdoms.
Yeah.
And so once you have that tension, the question is how.
Right. And in the book of Revelation, the precondition for again, like I said, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Like the precondition for the arrival of the New Jerusalem, which is like maybe the potential of the polis restored, we can say, is the destruction of all that.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I don't know where to go with this conversation, Nate, but this is really good.
I'm not pretending to have all the answers.
But I was just.
But I will. This is what. But I will take a stand when it is something I know, and I know something as fundamental as the concept of social justice itself is not something we want to let go of. Even if there are people that have really bad ideas about what social justice is, we better hold on to that.
And when you say social justice, you mean basically you mean just basically justice. I mean, putting part of the difficulty,
right? Because there's no in social. I mean,
right?
There's no justice is inherently social,
right? Right, because it's, well, again, I'm a preacher. I'm thinking about how these words are heard. We could say justice is fundamentally relational. It's between,
correct. Yes,
it's between persons and it's between bodies.
Yes.
When we're talking bodies, we're talking about, assembled, we're talking about groups that have spiritual centers, that have organization, that have body, basically. And I know in those who have followed the conversation with John Vervaeke and Peugeot about body should be able to understand that. We use that language when we talk about the body politic. We use that language when we talk about an ecclesiastical body. And so justice has everything to do with relationships between persons and between groups of persons. And also those bodies are also historical. And, you can have unjust relationships. You can have injustice between bodies that are historical. And then the conversation has to deal with. And that's part of why I sort of.
So when you talked about bodies, that made me think about like the concept of the modern state, which like one of the things that you'll find with post-liberals is actually they don't like the idea of the modern state any more than anarchists do, which is one of the reasons I read post-liberals, right? So they actually believe in the nation as a people,
right?
Which is a different thing from what the modern state is. And you can actually see, like, if you look at like something like Hobbes' Leviathan, it's like it's an antichrist kind of assemblage.
Yeah.
Like it's
so well, and even again, language is difficult because when we talk about a nation or state, you can use Greek like ethne, which of course is the term in the New Testament for a nation, the ethne. But of course, once you use that term ethne, immediately we think about, if we talk about ethno-nationalism.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Versus, let's say, credo-nationalism. And what you have in the United States is one of the most, arguably one of the most successful credo-nationalist bodies that at least we've seen. I'm watching the body language.
No. It just made me think of something. So on the ethno-nationalism, I actually think that Malcolm X was an ethno-nationalist for African Americans within the United States. I wrote a paper about this in college.
Yes. No, he definitely was.
I had wrote an anti-multicultural studies op-ed for my college newspaper, and one of my friends like came to me and is like, the professor who teaches that is like really awesome and inspires a lot of people. And she was really hurt by your article. You should take one of her classes and get to know her as a person. And I liked this. It was a female who I liked. So I listened to what she told me. And I took one of her classes and I got to be friends with her. And I didn't stop being a neocon. My final paper was on how Malcolm X was a traditional conservative. Like that was what my paper was. And she agreed that my argument was good and gave me an A on the paper. So,
well, I want to, anyway. Grim said this, and, my fear with a conversation like this is that I'm a preacher, so I'm concerned about how things are heard. Pretend you're looking at Hobbes' Leviathan and describe it, please, Nate.
As a monstrosity, like a mockery of it, and it has like sort of like a humanish looking structure, but it looks like a mockery of a man. To me, it's easily linked to Antichrist, honestly.
Eric wades in to help Grim Grizz. Incoherent screaming and gunfire. I don't know if Hobbes' Leviathan is that incoherent. I think it's more diabolical, perhaps.
I agree. We agree entirely on that. Yeah, it is diabolical. For one, it's really, it kind of, it is, you can see its connection to this concept of the machine.
Yes. Oh, very much so.
Because Hobbes is counting on the automation of it, right?
Yep.
And like, you know what? When we run on the automatic, we do evil.
Yep. So Aaron, I know Aaron. He's a really sharp philosophy teacher in the Netherlands. Hobbes' Leviathan is made entirely out of people, only people.
Yeah, it's a monstrous body.
Yes, yeah, but it is in fact a body, and
yes.
and part of it's interesting with the rise of the non-player character meme. We are looking at the turning people into machines, and also when I look at Twitter and this very flat internet of people that the only filter through which they can see things and then react to things, and then you see like the reduction of agency and everything is for or against. That's all. It's just one or the other. And I see that as, again, turning things into a mechanistic body. An engine historically is something that just goes round and round and round and round perpetually. And we use that to wash our clothes and to drive our cars and to generate electricity. that back with the steam engine and the water wheel, it's just about around and around and around and around. And it's sort of it's losing your agency. It's the dehumanization. It's people being devoured by machine and becoming machine. And I think in that sense, I know Anselman always sort of does not like the term anarchy.
One of the primary functions of the machine is it makes it's impossible for us to talk to each other.
Yes. And not only
because it gets us more and more isolated and only talking to people that are part of like our group.
Yep.
That thinks the way we do.
Yep.
And you can't function with no one knows what they don't know. And this is where I would say Peterson this is another where Peterson failed in this Twitter thing, because it's like one of his principles is that, assume that you have that the person that you're talking to has something worth saying.
Yes.
He doesn't give Francis that courtesy.
Yes.
He doesn't bother to read any of the traditional Catholic social teaching to figure out what Pope Francis might mean by social justice. He just assumes it based on a culture warframing, and goes on the attack.
Yeah. Which, part of the irony of the Peterson story is that on one hand, his rules, his 12 rules, a lot of good rules in that, which he himself struggles to keep.
Of course he does. I don't want to act like he's really uniquely bad for not being able to adhere to his own principles. We all do that.
No, absolutely. But one of the interesting facts about the Jordan Peterson story, I really do think someday biographers are just going to have. I mean, the Jordan Peterson biography is going to be a fascinating thing when you think about his wife and his daughter and everything that's happened. Yet there's this on one hand, there's this Jordan that is of the 12 rules, where you choose your words carefully, you put your own house in order before you go out into the world. And, so there are many rules in which you could turn around at that tweet and say, Jordan, there's this rule about your own house in order. There's this rule about thinking that maybe the Pope and the Catholic Church, which is arguably a church that he's of any of the churches, maybe drawing close to, I don't know. So you could very easily tag him, but this tension has always been in the rise of Jordan Peterson. I remember Poe the person said to me, came for the culture war, stayed for the religion. And part of what we've seen with Jordan is always sort of this back and forth between these. We wouldn't know him.
I think Pope Francis is a similarly misunderstood figure to Jordan, interestingly enough. I think that the conservative Catholics misrepresent and misframe Pope Francis as badly as progressive left opponents of Jordan Peterson misrepresent and misframe him.
Get that one, reap that one there, Grizz. Get that clip right there, because I think it's a good one.
And I can see why it happens. I think Hank was right when he said that Pope Francis isn't the best communicator. I think Hank had that fundamentally right. But the bottom line is that at the end of the day, what Pope Francis is above anything else is a Christian. And when you are consistently Christian in your positions, you are going to say things that are going to make people mad on both sides of the culture war. Period.
They did crucify Jesus. I mean, that's a deep part of the faith. I mean, you wouldn't think that the Pharisees and the Hellenists could agree on anything, except they both wanted Jesus dead.
Well, so Pope Francis is going to criticize the extremes of unfettered capitalism, yes, but he's also going to be unambiguously pro-life. I mean, and both, he can find support for both things within Christianity. They're just Christian positions.
And I think it's also true that
I agree with you, Eric. I don't understand his I think it's really weird because he's doing it for ecumenical motivations. And he's actually deliberately trying to reduce the power of the papacy. But if you want to be in favor of allowing for a diversity of forms of worship, then why are you not allowing for the traditional forms of your own tradition? It's it makes no sense.
Yeah.
He should back off from that. You're entirely right. The traditional Latin Mass is beautiful. I'm with you on that.
Yeah. Well, and part of what I often see too is that Jordan B. Cooper made a comment about Protestants and celebrity, and I put a picture of the Pope up because celebrity has, I think, long been an aspect that the church fathers were celebrities within their own certain celebrity arena. It might be argued that our current arenas also, the agent and the arena always impact each other. Yeah, it's very interesting because often you'll see if the Pope says something on an airplane, like, who am I to judge? But then if you read enough of what the Pope is saying, the news isn't gonna pick up that Pope Francis.
Right, exactly. So yes, exactly. It's just an overreaction to the headlines that never runs. But what if you look at what the Pope says in full context, they're almost always just very Christian things that he's saying. And someone grabs a headline and misrepresents it and tries to read into it what they want to hear.
So W3 Wrong says, could you say Jordan had his own enlightenment and is now living in his own Protestant Reformation? Well, he certainly picked a very interesting day to start his little AC.
Well, I don't think ARC. Jordan. I think Jordan is. I mean, he's very much still invested in Enlightenment principles,
Yes.
and economic liberalism. Like those are more important to him than any form of Christianity, which he is not fully committed to at all. Like, so that's where he's coming from. He's coming against the Pope on the basis of the way that a right liberal would object to the things that Francis said, because he thinks that Francis is not understanding right liberalism. The Christian stuff is just like, he's wielding Christianity as a political weapon in the case of these tweets, which he really has no right to do as a non-Christian.
Now, you say in the case of these tweets, do you mean that for the rest of him too? Because I very much see him as a religious seeker.
I agree with that. I'm not saying, he's very much a religious seeker. And also I want to point out that people on the other side of the culture war wield Christianity for their political purposes too. Yeah. He's not the only person playing that game.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I have enough respect for Jordan to think that he knows better than some other people that I hold him to a higher standard.
Yeah.
I'm surprised when he would resort to using Christianity as a political weapon instead of trying to actually understand it on its own terms. Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And part of the problem is none of us are always our best selves. And
no.
I think Twitter tempts all of us into doing things that upon further reflection and a little bit more slow contemplation, we might say, I probably shouldn't have written that. You just sit there and let the thing fly.
I had a rule for a long time that I just wouldn't talk about anything political at all or anything that was trending.
Yeah.
And I regret it every time I break that rule. But sometimes you feel strongly enough about something that you can't shut up.
Okay. I don't know if I'm trying to keep an eye here on the comment stream. I don't know if there's any questions in the comments or something you wanted to bring up, Nate. But I very much wanted to, because I was hearing you mostly on Twitter, and via what we had said about Twitter, part of my rule about Twitter is once I feel things getting contentious, I don't do back and forth with people on Twitter because
that's why I had a when I said that, like, was it today or last night? I had a recent interaction with Jacob, and I was just like, let's not talk about this on Twitter. Like, it's either do it face to face or not at all, because it won't be. Yeah, you can't. The problem with Twitter is it's too hard. It's too hard to make yourself understood.
Yes,
and the fact that you can't just have a one-on-one conversation, and there are other people jumping in and putting their thoughts in it too. And sidetracking things even more and basically creating chaos, it automatically feeds the war of all against all.
Yes. So Hobbes is stalking us. I should rename this. Hobbes is stalking us.
Yeah.
All right. Questions from the comments. Anybody got any questions there in the comments, or should I just drop the link and let some people come in? James Lindsay's out there doing his thing. James Lindsay has thoroughly documented how Francis is a student of Paulo Freire, the Marxist pedagogue who defined the methods and terminology that became what was commonly known as wokeism. Part of the difficulty in a certain approach to I'd call it political theoretical taxonomy, is these aren't discrete groups. I mean, I love The Rest is History. Early on, one of the early podcasts they did about Marxism, and I thought Tom Holland was exactly right. You're not going to have Marxism without Christianity.
No,
and so there's
correct.
Just so much intertwined.
And Christian socialism is far older than Marxism.
Yes.
Far older than Marxism.
Yes.
So, and the idea that wokeism is a Marxist phenomenon is based on circumstantial nonsense, and Lindsay's analysis is wrong.
All right. Jacob has a question. If social justice is only justice, why call it social justice?
Because it operates in the social sphere.
I'd say, and I tend to say, again, because of my focus on being misunderstood, I would probably, I've not used the term much just because at some points things get too hot where certain names and certain terms just trigger people, and it's like, all right, I'll, you know this in a marital spat.
Yeah, I just refuse to surrender. I refuse to surrender perfectly good concepts to bad operators. So I'm just stubbornly persistent in using social justice as I always have.
All right, let's see. Next question. How do we take back the term social justice as Christians?
Right. By doing it better.
by doing it better. I think it's a good answer. Why does the authority of a king look like? What does the authority of a king look like in Christian anarchist monarchism?
I don't like it. So that's a very good question, and I would say that it doesn't. He wouldn't really have any authority. It's just be symbolic. He's there for he's there as a unifying figure. So that to provide like a cultural unity, but he doesn't have any real power. In fact, that's the entire point for him to have like almost no power.
It's basically
Tolkien was kind of an anarcho-monarchist too.
Yeah,
and Tolkien actually suggested the idea that he should be as incompetent and inbred as possible.
Although, isn't that what happened to the stewards in at Gondor? All right, Grim Grizz has a question. If Jordan Peterson's Twitter strategy is calculated and not natural, is this stream an indication of strategic efficacy?
I would say if you're saying that his objective was to spark a debate about what social justice is, that would be true, except for his follow-up tweet in response to a perfectly sensible conservative Catholic article from a conservative source was to deny that authentic social justice is a thing. So that can't be it.
Yeah, and that's where I want to hesitate to simply assume that all actors on Twitter are unidimensional, yet I think we've seen enough from Jordan, and he's even been explained enough and been open enough that, yeah, I get done with everything in the day and I sit down with my phone, and if you look at his Twitter stream, there's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious from what he said that like he is not the kind of person who should be on Twitter, and I think he knows this about himself too, right?
And before he was with Daily Wire, when he would, I got to tell people to change the password on my Twitter account. So keep me from it,
So it's like, God bless you, Jordan. You got a problem. We still love you. It's okay.
All right. Freedom's Lunch. Paul, are you witnessing to the wolf or giving him victims? I think about this question. I really do. Because I've especially learned this now being on YouTube and talking to more people than my little local church afforded me before. You never quite know when you sort of help people down a road, you never quite know where that goes for them. So it's a good question. Let's see. Bingo. Look at his Twitter suit. Question from David Williams. All right. Question for both Paul and Nate. Beyond Jordan Peterson's obvious current cultural relevance, what religious impact do you think he'll have 200 years from now, if any?
Wow.
I just have a hard time imagining when we look at everything that's changed in the last 200 years. I mean, think about people who have had deep impact that lasts longer than decades. Think Augustine, Plato. I mean, those are huge names.
It's pretty unlikely.
The washing machine. Go ahead.
Statistically unlikely, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's certainly true. But I think, and this is something that people, I think Jordan has had, it's always difficult to talk about scale too, because when I talk about Jordan Peterson and Jordan Peterson revival, people sometimes make it think that this is a blip overall in the world church. No, the world church is so massive that to actually move the needle in terms of all kinds of things in the church and the world, even Jordan is a very small fish. YouTube, a YouTube channel of 5 million and maybe 2+ million on Twitter is really not a lot, not enough to move a lot of needles. But relatively speaking, this is where also the Jordan Pope thing gets interesting. And like when I asked Cale, would Jordan get a papal audience? No. And yep, I think that's
almost
exactly
certainly
right.
not.
Almost certainly not. He's a
There
small
is
fish.
Here is the thing that we are not maybe that we were discounting is that you have to calculate the ripple effect, right?
Yep.
So we don't know who Jordan may have impacted that might end up having an impact even greater than what he said.
YouTube user. Okay. Peterson and Lindsay are dangerous to the future of our planet. Maybe being used by the dark side, the mothers of individualism and so-called freedom. Wow, from a YouTube user.
I think there's some truth to the suspicions there, but I think that both of them are probably more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And Lindsay's actually a bigger problem than Peterson.
Did Cromwell kill the king? Is not Christ king, priest, and prophet? That's part of the challenge.
Well, that's the thing, though. That's the debate, right? It's like yes, we all acknowledge that Christ is the King of Kings, but the question is that are other kings who have submitted to the authority of Christ legitimate or not? And for most of Christian history, the answer to that is yes, they are legitimate.
Our resident father says Orthodox couples and babies is probably the biggest impact. That could very well be. Amen. So here's a question. It's a good question. Is Christian anarchism the ideal? Wouldn't Girard say that this is impossible? Some violence is needed, law to prevent much more violence?
Well, I would think that's an inverse of what Girard is saying. I think Girard is saying that all human social structures have a foundational murder and violence at their core, which is what Christ came to repudiate. Girard is about as Christian anarchist friendly a thinker as you could possibly find.
That sounds right. Okay. Any more? Oh, here's another question. Question from Sevilla. What novelty has Jordan Peterson introduced to culture that he might be remembered long-term for? I don't look at Jordan as someone who brought novelty. I look at Jordan as someone who brought to the surface the tensions in decaying liberalism that had to be brought forward. I remember when I was talking to Dr. Jim, the cardiologist from Idaho, and he basically said he knew modernity and liberalism and atheism were dying because of the new atheists, because you often don't see really clear expressions of things until the body feels it's sort of like old people rallying when they, when they're in their 80s or 90s. I see this often. They're getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and then they rally. And I see Jordan as sort of very late stage liberalism, and via part of why I think it's Jordan, he also needed to have this mythological aspect, which is sort of probably a bridge more into, that's the perennial bridge, as it's said. So I see Jordan as what erupted given the decay of liberalism and modernity.
His particular blend of evolutionary biology and Jungian psychology is pretty different. I don't think there's anybody that quite has that unique blend. So that combination is somewhat novel and kind of unexpected. It's also very weird to see a conservative Jungian, because historically most Jungians have not been conservative. Like Joseph Campbell is much more representative of Jungians of the past than.
Well, I think conservatism is a relatively, and Peterson says this, it's a relatively recent thing for him. And I think that's partly because now we're seeing modernity and liberalism as conservatism, whereas just because of how things move
that's right.
so slowly.
Yeah, I would say, and I can actually identify with and understand that too, because it's like I started as a young, 18, 19-year-old progressive at Evergreen State College, and I had to be exposed to progressivism gone awry, even at that early stage, by the way, in order to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe progressives aren't right about everything. And then I was a neocon for the next 25 years.
Well, and I think, part of what I see rolling out in my denomination is it's often people like me who have, in my denomination, I've been a progressive. I've always been sort of on the left end of the Christian Reformed Church. Then I come out to California, and people then in Michigan don't quite understand me, because I look around at where things are going and they're like, well, why aren't you more excited? It's like, because I'm looking around and saying, this isn't working out the way y'all think it's supposed to.
Right.
And so I'm just a little bit sober, but it hardly makes me in a sense, a traditionalist in the Christian Reformed Church sense. So
right.
What is Nate's animating spirit?
I don't know. I'd rather have someone else answer that than try to say that about myself.
All right. What's Nate's animal? We'll see. What did you say the other day to me about a professor?
Oh yeah, he said this was when I was a freshman at Evergreen, and I was still hirsute even then, and a pretty big guy. And so my professor, Richard Alexander, who was one of the founders of Evergreen State College, he described me in his evaluation of me as sitting in seminar like an affable bear at a picnic table.
That seemed exactly right.
So I think, if you were to force me to it, I would say that I am pretty joyful. I mean, I'm very low in negative emotion. Even when I'm mad, I don't stay mad very long, and I just let it out and let it go.
Me too. That's a good thing to be. What would happen if Jordan Peterson came to Christ, told the destruction of his audience? This is something that comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And, look at, well, again, I'd recommend, depending on how much time I have today, definitely want to do something with the Tom Holland, Paul Kingsnorth conversation, because it's really fascinating.
It's a beautiful conversation.
That is a beautiful conversation.
And beautiful is the right word for it.
Yes, yes.
And Marcus was so brilliant in just keeping his mouth shut and letting it go.
Yeah, because Tom gets into interrogation mode, and that's where it got really good.
Yeah.
But, I think a lot of people think that if Jordan Peterson joined a church, he would become Dennis Prager, something like this. And I don't think that's true. He will still be Jordan Peterson. But I don't see Jordan, for as much as Jordan might go into an Orthodox church and, oh, look at the symbolism in the icons and the Catholic Church, and oh, look at the brilliance of Bishop Barron and the great tradition. Or I think he's just deeply, deeply Protestant, and Jordan, in that sense, will always worship in a church of his own making.
But almost all people in North America are, regardless of whether they're Orthodox or Catholic, or, I mean, unless they're in, the exception would be like recent immigrants.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the rest of us we have Protestant cultural sensibilities because America is fundamentally Protestant. That's just a reality we have to live with.
Yep. Okay. Aaron has a question. Will the Pope ever acknowledge Peterson's existence, and is Peterson hoping for that when he's punching up? I think. I mean, Jordan, as someone said, you know, he was basically pleading on Elon Musk to pay attention to him. I don't know if they've had any back channel conversations. Jordan likes celebrity and numbers. We've seen that. So the video, I haven't watched it today. He's talking to some guy who's running for, I don't know, the presidency from the Republicans. I don't know. So Jordan likes the limelight. He does. And I think he would like nothing better than to have a papal audience. I don't think he's going to get it, because I don't think Jordan, I mean, it's hard for people to understand. The world is massive, and the Catholic Church is massive. And so, you know, papal, I would imagine that papal politics, Jordan is not a big player in that world, I don't think. I don't know.
No, generally there's an indifference toward North American politics in general.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just true. And also I would say that there are people that are around Francis that are perhaps as bad as conservative Catholics in America fear. But I don't think it's necessarily true of Francis himself.
All right. Us Protestants don't take the call to evangelize. Protestants don't take the, well, it depends what you mean by evangelize. If we did, perhaps we could move the needle on what social justice means. I'm not so sure.
I mean, it's like everyone knew what it meant.
Yeah.
I mean, the confusion is new, right? The confusion is novel. Everyone knew what it meant. So
to be fair, Jung was a bit of a conservative Jungian.
Yes, that's true.
That's true.
But for whatever reason, most of the Jungians analysts I've known have been very progressive people.
Yeah. Yeah. Question: do you think Jordan Peterson's tweet to the Pope and how it's been received will or should cause a course change for Jordan? If so, what will change? I don't think so.
I don't think so.
What has changed? Well, I think having his colleagues turn on him at University of Toronto changed him.
Yep.
Having the media establishment in North America attack him changed him.
Well, it's normal to move. It's normal to evolve in a direction that is indicated by the people who are supportive of you, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, if the people that are supporting you are right liberal Daily Wire types, and you already have some inclinations that are headed in that direction anyway, then you're going to move more and more in that direction. And that's just human.
Yeah.
Like if progressives want Jordan to, I would say this, if progressives want Jordan to be more balanced, then more progressives should reach out to Jordan and try to talk to him.
Yes, absolutely.
It's
absolutely.
on them.
Yep. They, you know, I look at University of Toronto and think, if you really didn't want Jordan doing what he's doing now, you should not have pushed him out. You should have tried to keep him, because that would have tempered him. Here's a question. How does Nate view the difference between Babylon and Zion in relation to hierarchy?
I would say that it's not just like Babylon, and all prototypes of Babylon represent a hierarchy that is based on power. And I would say Zion, or at least true Zion, is a hierarchy based on authority, and that they're not the same thing. And actually, this is a distinction that Jordan seems to see. I've caught him recently, like, making that distinction, and correctly.
Yeah.
And I would say that when you dig down to it, authority ultimately discloses itself as simply being love. Yeah. I'm sorry, Jacob, but that's what authority ends up disclosing itself to be.
Yeah. I agree. I'm team love on this, Jacob. And that's why Jacob, I think if now you have to understand, here we are with this word political again. If for some reason the Pope saw that it was in his interest to have a public audience with Jordan Peterson, I think Jordan would change his tune on some ways, and I think, but the Pope would have to see
the
something
Pope
to be
would
gained by
light
it.
those the slight inklings of distributist thinking that have cropped up to him, where it's like suddenly it's just dawned on Jordan recently that big government and big business are in collusion, which is something that Chesterton wrote about a long time ago. If these like little inklings of distributist thought that are starting to occur to him, those would get watered.
Yes.
And that's why one thing I want to say is that during this entire thing, I really have missed Mary Cohen's presence.
Yes,
because
yes.
she would have given such a correct and faithful representation of the Catholic view.
Yeah,
and she would have done it beautifully.
Yeah. No. Yeah. All right. Can anyone explain the Jordan Peterson tweet? Catholic is something that you are, not something you believe. Orthodoxy to Protestant ? A harder question.
It depends on I think they're thinking of evangelical Protestantism there mostly. I think that gets a little bit blurry when you start talking about like older Protestant traditions, like your tradition, Paul, or the Anglican tradition. Like, I think those are just as much something you are as something you believe. I think that the extreme like emphasis on beliefism is an evangelical phenomenon.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's just there are I've said this before, there are these things that happen in history that you can sort of no longer avoid. Jesus was certainly one of those. Protestantism, I think, was one of those. Once, I mean, the Catholic Church had to respond to the Protestant Reformation. It had no choice. And in Trent, it sort of tries to take some of the learnings and integrate it and not lose too much. But
that's a great point.
Doing the same thing in America.
That's the partially formed thought I had from earlier. I was talking about this essay about Barfield, and I was talking about how we think about tradition. And I would say this is what the Protestant Reformation, I have to concede, gets right, is that as tradition moves towards its final cause, what is happening is that it becomes more and more interiorized. And the exoteric structure becomes less important. This is Hezi and I actually had an exchange on the live stream the other day where Hezi was talking about how the temple has to be, or the tabernacle had to be built, and the outside of the tabernacle was supposed to be built first, and then the inside of the tabernacle. So we have to have both exoteric and esoteric understandings, and the move is from one to the other. Both as an individual believer evolves in their faith, and as the church collectively moves through history. And I think that's what Protestantism got right.
Yeah. All right. Aaron wants to know, Nate, you tweeted, this Peterson versus Pope thing is making me want to divorce from the TLC. Do you still think that? We like you.
That was me being reactive.
That was you being,
because I'm capable of it too. That was me being reactive and just expressing my feelings in the moment. I wasn't mad at anyone in particular. I want to be very clear about that. It's just like, it made me just feel like, I was seeing something other people weren't seeing that was really clear to me, and it was frustrating that no one else was seeing what I was seeing.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Or you couldn't see other people seeing what you were seeing.
Correct. Correct. That's an even better way of putting it.
Which is a huge problem in Twitter because, again, we're only seeing each other through a very limited
280 characters.
That's right. You can't see much through there.
Yeah.
Could you point out a regenerate king?
Charles III. Charles III. It's interesting. Charles III. I actually talked about Charles with off camera before my conversation with. I talked to Martin Shaw on the day the Queen died.
Oh, really?
And so, yes. And we talked before we started recording. We talked about the Queen, and then we talked about King Charles, and he was talking about how he had a lot of hope for King Charles as a monarch because they have several mutual friends, and Charles is a very interesting and sophisticated thinker. It's really weird when I see Americans like talking about what an idiot Charles is. It's like they really don't know what they're talking about. He's a very learned man who has some very interesting friends.
Yeah.
And he's definitely an ally of Christianity.
And I think, boy, there's just, it's so funny. Anytime I look at a David Brooks book on a what people put on a David Brooks book on Amazon, people keep mentioning his divorce. I think for many people in the world, they can't see past the Diana, however they view the Diana incident, especially through maybe The Crown or through other media. That's all they see is Diana. And seeing that point, it's very important, again, to think about how history works, because it could very well be that 100 or 200 years from now, Charles III will be viewed in a different way from how everyone views Charles through the tragedy that happened with his wife. So, and human beings are complex like that. And we just view each other through these narrow lenses. Aaron, sola scriptura, Protestantism is more cognitive than embodied. That's what he's referring to, right?
I don't know who the he refers
I don't know
to
who's
there.
Yeah, I'm not sure who he means.
I would say that it depends. It depends on how it depends. It really depends on. It depends on how you approach the text. Do you approach the text as it's purely analytically, or do you approach the text with an intent to commune with the text?
Yeah.
Or to commune with the author of the text?
And speaking as a Protestant, one of the chief forms of, let's say, heresies coming out of 19th century America was a certain approach to sola scriptura, where you have the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, everybody sitting down with the text and say, I'm going to read it as it is, which means that just whole realms of things just smuggle on through. And then you get these churches shaped like they do coming out of 19th century.
And because it's infinitely complex, what happens is everybody has their pet little thing that they decide to emphasize and misses the big picture.
Right. Would a conversation between Barron and Jordan Peterson be great at this moment? Yes, but it probably won't happen at this moment because you got to let a little time go by. Maybe, who knows? Maybe Barron could do it.
Barron is definitely going to stand up for the Catholic social teaching in that conversation.
Yeah.
And he'll do it, I think he'll do it lovingly. And I hope that conversation happens, because Jordan really did get this one wrong.
Karen says, I haven't listened to the VVAC conversation. VVAC Convo is not about limelight. It brings to the fore all the issues that Jordan Peterson is concerned about and gives him an opportunity to help his listeners be aware of these issues. That may very well be, Karen, but Jordan does like the limelight. I think he really does. And it's not a criticism. It's just a factor of who he is. And the difficulty is that there's danger in the limelight. And I think Jordan has, paid for a lot of things with his fame and his wealth now. And I know, Nate, you reacted to my tweet about who's wealthier, the Pope or Jordan Peterson. But for me, that was a provocative tweet, because once you ask that question, you very, very quickly have to wrestle with, well, what on earth do you mean?
Yeah, it's like a category here, because the Pope is technically as under a vow of poverty and doesn't own anything.
Yes.
So
yeah. So
and then also there's I think someone else brought up the issue of spiritual riches too.
Yes.
So it's like, what do you mean?
Yes.
On what level of analysis?
Yes. I got this great quote, Gavin Ashenden, on his conversation with Karen.
I have to watch this conversation.
You do. It's really
Karen emailed me earlier today too, so I definitely have to watch it.
It's a terrific conversation, even if and this is another one of my point is that, and I really want to push people beyond the binary flat filter of Twitter and this current cultural context, because you should be able to listen to a conversation where you disagree ferociously with a person or their persona or their political posture and still be able to find a lot of great things in it. And I thought I loved that conversation between Karen and Gavin. I thought it was tremendous. So Jess, who we all love.
Hey, Jess.
He is a wonderful, wonderful man. As we move from exoteric to esoteric, what do we do about the lack of beautiful architecture? Seems like that's been an unfortunate side effect, loss of beauty in some way.
So I would say that is I would put the loss of beauty up, Jess. And I know Jess is an artist, and he just was on a trip to Europe and saw lots of beautiful architecture. So I'm sure this is on the forefront of his mind. I would say that the cause of the loss of beauty is, and I know this is going to make people mad to say this, but it is capitalism, and specifically this aspect of capitalism because it prioritizes efficiency above all else, and is so much based on quantitative analysis. There's an automatic loss of quality that comes with it. I am not against markets. I'm not against fair and just exchange. But capitalism is a different thing from that. And specifically what it hasn't, like this horrible bug that it has in it, is that efficiency is its, this has to do, and it's not just capitalism, it's just the reign of quantity in modernity in general. Causes loss of quality. So I don't think it's not the move from the exoteric to the esoteric that causes that. I would say that we can be esoterically motivated to create expressions of beauty too, and I think this is like the good part of romanticism. You can see the seeds of that. So this is kind of what Barfield is pointing toward in Romanticism Comes of Age. So
when I went to Europe, I'd never been to Europe before. And of course, one of the things that just strikes you very quickly are all the beautiful buildings. There's a lot of ugly buildings in Europe too. And then just the thought that occurred to me was, if you want something to last, build it beautiful, because people will just be like, even if you see this with churches often, even if you, from a preacher's point of view, that old church is just like, oh gosh, how are we going to maintain this thing? But you don't dare take it down because there it is.
I just wanted to say this really quickly because it makes me think of it, validating Jacob's vision. I really like his picking up the language of cathedral, because the language of cathedral, you're talking about something where the people that are building it don't even have the chance of seeing its realization, right?
Yeah.
And cathedral building is motivated. It's motivated by love. It's not done. It is not practical. It is not efficient. It is precisely a subversion of both of those things. And I think that's a good concept. And in as much as what he is trying to do is something to try to be something like a cathedral, I am fully supportive of that.
I just want to note here that when people who are common adversaries in the comment section agree, I love it. I love it. Call me Lex Fridman, but when Anselman agrees with Jacob, I like it. All right. Let's see. Oh, you got to give Vivian B a comment or two. King Charles is an ally of Christianity. Okay. How do the Northern Ireland Catholics feel about the monarchy?
Yeah. I understand. I'm not saying that he's perfect. And I would say that's probably something I'm too ignorant about to discuss. But my natural inclination would be that I would want to see Ireland independent.
Well, it was interesting when I was in Ireland. So there's no border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the country. And so, it's a complex situation. Ireland.
Yeah, it's like basically quasi-autonomous, but not fully independent.
Yeah.
And I get it.
It's a very interesting situation.
It's complicated by the fact that you have these traditional, people that have been there for a long time that are not Catholic.
Yep. Aren't Pentecostal acts Protestant sola scriptura? There's a Biblicism and sola scriptura are not the same thing. And there's a lot of Biblicism in certain Pentecostal groups. Like I've been doing some reading recently of some of the Jesus people movement. That was a very biblicist movement.
Yeah, it was.
And one of the interesting things about biblicism is that there are different kinds of biblicism. I mean, Anabaptists tend to, Calvinists tend to have a rationalist biblicism, sort of a doctrinalist biblicism. Anabaptists tend to have much more of an activity biblicism. So they'll take a look at the the commands of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, like the pacifism and turn the other cheek, and they'll say, we're not going to have a rationalist analysis of this. We're going to actually live this out and see where that changes us. And so it's the world is big and complex. Okay. Aaron, capitalism doesn't just prioritize efficiency, also short-termism.
Yeah.
Also, it appeals to our lower instincts. Look how popular TikTok and sugar are. That's very true. Oh, question with a K from What Up. What Up is a very regular, meaty commenter on my channel. When Andrew Tate flew Michaela from Germany to Romania to talk business, is it okay to ask, might Jordan have traveled with her, being the business top guy? The whole, I don't know if you know anything about this whole business of Michaela and Andrew Tate.
Only because of you. But that sounds pretty salacious.
Well, yeah. I don't know. Andrew Tate, I don't know what to say about him. Now, this apparently is someone you know. I noticed.
Yeah, that's my brother-in-law.
Oh, it's your brother-in-law.
Yeah.
Why pay to make a beautiful building when it'll reduce the return on investment for the speculative landowner that just wants to throw up 100 units of housing and run with the money?
Yet another reason to build cathedrals, Slack.
Yep. Your brother-in-law. Well, that's fun. Let's see. Any more questions? Bryson Cole. Would our social institutions stand without capitalism?
Ooh, I would say that the modern nation state is the great enemy of all social institutions. I don't think that capitalism doesn't really there were social institutions before capitalism. Actually, most of the social institutions before capitalism, let's take a look at the medieval period, like before capitalism was an idea. And it was the church that built the social institutions. So I think we'll have social institutions without capitalism for sure. We probably will have more.
Oh, come on. I want to get this into the stream here before we get the most important question by Dave Williams, which is Andrew Tate is Tate's brother-in-law?
Definitely not. No.
All right.
Precarious is.
So there is the link. Now, again, my rule in terms of coming onto the stream is you have to have your camera. You have to have your camera on. I won't take people coming in without their camera on. So Nate, bingo on the issue of quality. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And I want to say, maybe nobody will join us. I don't know if anybody wants to come in, but conversations like this are exactly.
This is the first time we've talked without a buffer, by the way.
It really is. It is. So
there's always been at least one more person in the conversation every time we talked in the past.
Yeah. But this is the kind of thing. I don't think I was smart enough to know that this is what I wanted. But this is exactly the kind of thing I want from this little corner, is for us to have better conversations. Speaking of better conversations, one of my favorite guys around here. And how are you, Fezzy?
Thank God. I've been enjoying my camera seems very strange right now, like it's zoomed in.
No, I can put you in something like this too.
All right.
So
just to dive into the topic, first of all, I hope both are well. I'm looking at Jordan Peterson. I think we all know that he's trying in a certain way to affect both religion and politics but more specifically, I mean, and I discussed it with Jacob, I see religion and politics, they're both combined. And I see politics being used as a divine tool. The Israelites are being given an option to look around them and see if they want to put a king on top of them or not, or have a monarchy. I don't even see that as a monarchy, but I think the Bible is giving an option for using king as placeholder for political structure. And this relates also to the justice he's fighting about. I mean, we have in the Bible that we are supposed to pursue justice, and that is to be embodied in the land. So the Bible is talking about a political arena, and we see that because we could have a kumbaya moment of a rabbi and a pastor and a Buddhist, but they don't move the needle. And politics on the ground and policy on the ground moves the needle. So I look at Jordan, and he's going up to the Pope who's occupying said throne and saying, I need to talk to you about social justice. Like, look at the world. Look what's happening around you. You're coming out with a tweet that has a hashtag on it. That's a symbol. That means something.
But every single thing that the Pope pointed to in that original tweet, you can find in the Hebrew Bible.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Every single thing that the Pope pointed to as social justice in that tweet, you can point to and has a basis in the Hebrew Bible. Every single thing.
No doubt. How is it being heard though by all these people? They're seeing social justice, right? So Jordan Peterson is responding.
Hashtag social justice.
Hashtag social justice. So he's responding in kind, and we look at it like the limelight, which I don't want to say like I could deny, but isn't that what we're as a collective asking from him? Like, push, go, do. He's building an ark. Like, it doesn't get more symbolic than that. Like, he's calling this. So, and I'll stop this rant. How about him being, remembered 200 years from now? If this is a Kairos moment, which is a meaning crisis, and we're moving postmodern, so he might be remembered because he seems to be currently in this, and also due to social media and how it exacerbates and highlights certain characters. I think he might be someone that's remembered. It could be that it will be it won't be too kind, but he might end up moving the needle.
I think Chezi's bringing in the illustration of Israel in terms of this question of religion and politics and religion, to me, just is completely fascinating. Partly because it's not Protestant. It's to me that's sort of what just continues to fascinate me in here. I'm going to pull in a whole bunch of new folks.
I don't know, but wouldn't you say, Paul, that like political theology is what Kuyper is doing to a certain extent?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
but it's what's interesting to me is that, so I, going to Calvin College, of course, got all of this talk about Kuyper and principled pluralism and all of this stuff. I don't think at Calvin it was very, very much distinguished from it differentiated from kind of a moderate democratic application, and nobody at Calvin College would say, okay, it was, at least when I went to Calvin, 80 years since Kuyper was prime minister and they had pillarization. How did that work out in the tiny little nation of the Netherlands? Because when I started my channel and started talking to Hollanders and they'd talk about pillarization, they'd kind of be like, that was a failed experiment. So, so all you Calvin profs who kept talking about principled pluralism and Abraham Kuyper, where's the beef? Did it work out? Even part of the strange things is we keep looking to little countries like the Netherlands or Sweden as these models, but these are the whitest, smallest. They're very different animals from a 330 million person nation as diverse as the United States. So,
which begs the question: is it natural or right for a nation to be that big and ungainly?
Yeah. Good question. So,
I'd like to get back to that fireball that has he called a hashtag? I think that's a really important aspect that is most people are blind to. Is it okay for the Pope to do a hashtag blunder because he's a boomer? Does he not? Does he not understand that that's a fireball on the Baal network of the word the ball bird? I like it's like a snowball rolling downhill, and he's adding Pope gravity to that snowball when he uses that hashtag. It's not nothing that he did it. So somebody probably should have called him out on its use, but he's the Pope.
Or the staffer.
Doesn't having a different concept introduced to a hashtag help? Because I guarantee you what the Pope meant by social justice does not align with most of the people who would use hashtag social justice think of social justice. Not even remotely. The other question I was asked is like, does anyone think that Pope Francis actually wrote that himself? I don't. Seems highly unlikely.
Which makes it all more interesting.
I think it makes it more like you're going to be sending. You're going to have your minions or your whoever's in charge of your social sending this out, and even if that person knows, he's like, listen, I'm going to piggyback on social justice. Obviously, all the things I'm mentioning over here are all legit, and they find their origins in the Bible. I think Jordan's sort of saying to the Pope, you are the one that's supposed to be speaking up about what justice is, because seemingly there's confusion around the world. So how about you, person on the throne, get up? Please point to anything that the Pope listed in that tweet that's actually a problem from the point of view of the Hebrew Bible. There is no problem with the tweet. I think, again,
Jordan. So then why are we feel the need to call it out then?
The hashtag.
There's a problem with multiple languages going on at the same time, and people are talking cross purposes. But the issues of social justice, and if you get off down the rabbit hole of James Lindsay, that's a very particular view of what's going on, where Peterson's also seeing from a similar view. Oh, it's this Marxism, it's this problem. Whereas there's an entirely different historical tradition in the Catholic Church of social justice. And it's a completely different language meeting in the middle and causing issues where they're not quite speaking the same language here.
I was going to say, because I was one that stirred the pot a little bit on Twitter, because, and I would say, like, coming from the evangelical perspective, like, I'm very much in favor of social justice. Like, that is why I started this project I've been working on, which is live now. There's some videos out there. It's called Tectonic School. So if anybody wants to check it out.
Put a link in the comments.
But it's just, I think the thing is, we get so distracted. Like, to me, it's like the idea that there's a Pope, like, it's just, and living in the internet age, it's just weird because, like, people get to have global opinions and they waste a lot of time having global opinions instead of focusing on local influence that they could actually do and put into practice. And so, and that's why, to me, what I see as most beneficial about Peterson is that he did this kind of weird thing. He's like, there's no rules against me renting a theater and talking about the Bible. Let's see what happened. And he sort of started a weird internet church by doing that. That we're all kind of part of his weird internet church because we're contributing to that kind of project that he started. And
that's it. Jordan Peterson started a church and married somebody. It's called the Church of Not Following Stupid Rules, and he's the metropolitan of it. Everyone's all, when will Jordan Peterson go to church? He's made his own church already. You have to pay attention to what they pretend are jokes. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
You do see.
He says that and then he vanishes.
That's very grim praise, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, that's
This is the
hilarious.
only professing Protestant around here. This is.
So Hezi, like I said, I don't know if you heard the beginning of our conversation. It actually was the initial. If you want to like the initial tweet, if it's like he's taking objection to the hashtag or whatever, that's fine. It was actually the one that I had a serious problem with was the follow-up quote tweet of the Washington Examiner article, which was it's a conservative source. It was written by a conservative Catholic from a very conservative point of view, just pointing out to Peterson, this is what Catholics mean when we talk about social justice. And Peterson's response to that was to deny that authentic social justice even exists. And that's what I had a problem with. And I would expect a Jewish person to have a problem with that too, because the idea of social justice is certainly important to the Jewish tradition as well.
My focus was more on the former, less on the latter, and I'll agree with you that I think once Jordan is in his once his eyes, his focus, his lens, as you know, as he's found a target, it's very hard for him to let go, and I think that's Jordan being Jordan. So like, I have no problem with criticizing him. My general point is, punching up, even at the Pope. I know that to me isn't that. As long as you're coming, from a true place, and you could argue that he wasn't coming from that second tweet. He was already going at from a more personal point of view. But again, I think it was a very big mistake to have that hashtag. Sam, you're muted.
You muted,
yep,
Sam.
You're muted, Sam.
You're not muted by this. You're muted by something else. No, still can't hear you. We're waiting.
Keep on talking. Now we're gonna wait.
In the meantime, I do want to briefly address Lance's point about Pope Francis sometimes supporting politicized versions of social justice, and the answer that is yes, of course, because not everything that politicized social justice stands for is contrary to the Catholic notion of social justice. And in as much as those things are in line with Catholic social teaching, yes, of course, Pope Francis is going to support them, as he ought to.
I thought that, can you guys hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. I thought that one of the things that was most interesting is what it revealed about the current state of Jordan Peterson's own theology, right? Because like, the Pope's going to ignore it. Is he going to get a papal audience? No. Should he? Probably not even. But his own theological instincts, what he's saying in the main tweet, redemptive salvation is a matter of the individual soul, right? And that I think that's interesting in that, Jordan Peterson talks about, well, what can I do to improve society? I see all of these problems, right? How can I improve society? Well, I can go around and strengthen the individual, right? And that's sort of one of his crusades is giving people resources to strengthen the individual with self-authoring and room cleaning and other forms of individualized encouragement delivered at mass scale. And I think that is still kind of what he views Christianity as what it should be doing too. And I think he's just really kind of Protestant, almost Billy Graham-ish at heart, that, Billy Graham went around trying to save a bunch of individual souls and then also get them into churches and have institutions coming along behind that. But, get yourself exposed to as many individuals as you can, give them a gospel presentation, and hope for as many conversion experiences as you can get out of that. And I think that Jordan Peterson still views Christianity basically that way.
Right, which is half the gospel, because that's the gospel about Jesus, but Christianity also has the gospel of Jesus, which is the gospel of the kingdom. And social justice is about the church, in as much as it can, living in accordance with the principles of the kingdom while it's here on this earth. So you can't just have one of those things without the other. They go together. But I agree with you. That's exactly what his analysis is. Which is interesting because it's interesting that he chooses to focus on the gospel about Jesus as the point of emphasis, because as far as I can tell, that's the one thing he is least ready to accept.
That's a good point. That's because in many ways, part of Jordan's motivation, even as you've constructed it, Sam, is Western civilization continues to need this approach to Christianity, yet in a very real sense, he sort of stands outside that entire thing. My question with this for you, Nate, is to what degree is this sort of a Christian anarchism that, and Gavin Ashenden makes the same point in his point to Carol that Sam just made. American evangelicals have made this point too, that what the church's real job is to change the individuals, and then the individuals go out there and construct a society. But isn't that sort of an anarchical way to approach it?
That's right, precisely right, which is why I found myself having to challenge my own political axioms and presuppositions, because I realized that, like, no, my objection to Peterson dismissing social justice as such was really strong, and the more I examined like why that was the way I felt about it, the more I realized is that I was operating under some unexamined axioms of my own, and which is why I find myself in kind of like, okay, maybe I need to go back and read the post-liberals even more closely again.
If you look back to when Peterson was uploading his lecture series to YouTube, and he put Maps of Meaning up there, he talks about his how he was traumatized during the Cold War, and how his kind of philosophical journey came from this existential dread that he felt growing up, feeling the threat of nuclear annihilation. And this is where a lot of his focus on Marxism as the root of the problem is from. And I kind of wonder how deep Peterson's knowledge of the Catholic kind of theology, the Catholic history, the Catholic approach is. And that basis, that reaction to the Cold War and existential dread is where he's so based in liberalism, classical liberalism. And that then leads into the very Protestant perspective. I don't know if that helps in any sense.
No, and it also raises an interesting question, because it actually, if you look at, like, a lot of times he defends liberalism primarily from this sort of quantitative analysis. But if you look at, like, Tsarist Russia compared to, say, Stalinist Russia, and your only measure is, like, quantitative, like how is the standard of living, like, things objectively improved under communism. Like, that's just the truth. It did. So,
but maybe not as much as they improved in the West. I mean,
maybe not, but they still improved.
Yes.
So, which leads to the question, like, well, was it really just capitalism that caused the improvement, or were there other things going on, like, may say increases in technology, for example, that contributed to that to that increase in the standard of living across the board as well? Because it seems to have also impacted communism. You could say the same thing of you know, China before and after the revolution, same thing. So, which is not a defense of communism. I hate communism as much as he does, or Marxism as much as he does. But not all socialism is Marxist. And unfettered capitalism is just as bad.
Did America invent the internet because it's capitalist, or did we invent the internet because we needed a lot more battleships during World War II than Russia did, and we built them in Silicon Valley? Right. And battleships are a lot more electronically complicated than tanks and infantry.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm
sort of backing up your point.
Yeah. No, yeah, exactly. That's why it's a little simplistic to just, like, reduce it to, you know, capitalism versus Marxism. It's
that's my
certainly from a Catholic perspective. It's because it's Catholicism doesn't like either, and for good Christian reasons.
Well, this is my thoughts on this. The simplistic nature of the tweet or of the hashtag is probably what bothers Peterson, as maybe as much as the actual, you know, ruffling his so-called pseudo-conservative feathers. But it's like you're the Pope. You are supposed to be somebody who is dignified and well spoken, and you're going to give something as simple as this. Well, if you're going to do that, then I'm going to do something as simple as this. It's like the whole thing about Twitter is like you can't get any high resolution stuff, and so maybe that's his kind of his point. Like, you're the Pope, you shouldn't be playing in a low resolution arena.
The Pope was merely simply restating things that are Christian truisms.
Of course,
I don't
know. I understand all of that. I'm just saying,
how
like,
is that like the whole point of it is to point out that we can't. The point of the tweet is to point out that we cannot allow the culture war to have us abandon the concept of social justice. That's actually the point of the tweet, and it points toward things that are just simple Christian principles that I have yet to hear anyone actually object to anything he said.
Well, here's what I would say, Nate. I think you have a problem with Jordan Peterson. It's obvious. Following your tweeting a number of different things. Also, it's like you mentioned a conservative paper. The things that really touch your button right now are things that are conservative. Now, I would say this. I went to a Catholic college, and we had to take 3 religion courses. And one of the religion courses I took was social justice. I literally, on my transcript, have a social justice class I took. And the point would be, like, when I talk with my Catholic friends, and I even saw, like, Wayne and others just talking about this, that Pope Francis has absolutely taken on some of the not just biblical social justice. By the way, Paul's a social justice guy. He's a Christian social justice guy. A lot of evangelicals are Christian, biblical Christian social justice people. Their time, their talent, their money are placed behind that. And so I get what you're saying, and I was a debater too, and so I see the text like you're pointing out. Well, yes, no one's disagreeing that social justice isn't supported in the Bible and isn't supported by
Peterson. Explicitly did, though. He said there is no such thing as authentic social justice. That's what he said.
And we get to but we get there. But when we get to the hashtag, and you see some of the things around that. I think what we also would have to say with Pope Francis, that's why all the trads are there. There is more to it than just that. There's context. There's actions that this Pope has taken that a lot of people who are on the other side of this, and I think it got into that. Now, I just want to say, you're framing this in a specific way to say these things. There's more to it. There's more context to it than that.
I actually have referenced some of those things myself in this conversation, Lance, and I entirely agree with you that there is a lot more nuance here. And my objection is very, very specific. What I said is that if we're going to play the game of rejecting social justice as such, as conservatives, then we're playing the wrong game. That's what my point was.
Do you think?
And that is precisely the move that he made.
Jordan Peterson, so I would ask you this with context. And you see the passion and the care that he thinks about he cares about the marginalized people. You can see the pain when he starts telling real stories in his practice and clinicians. When you see him actually thinking about the effects that some of these policies are going to have, he's thinking about the people down here, how it's going to crush those people who are truly just trying to get the truly impoverished people. Do you think it's fair to say that Jordan, he might go about it differently, but do you think it's fair to say that he rejects all notion? Yeah, it's in a tweet, it's everything else. We all can't put full context in a tweet, but I think.
Are you asking me if I think that?
But the context of Jordan Peterson as the person, I don't think he rejects all claims of social justice.
Okay, so
the way you're describing it,
is your claim is that he didn't mean what he said?
No, I think what he was doing was much like what Grimm pointed out here, is the whole hashtag social justice crowd, and that has a whole myriad of problems with it. You can't get away from it. He's speaking against that. I also think he sees the Pope aligning himself with the more militant elements of those things. I just think there's more.
Did you look at in his little document, his conservative manifesto? Did you notice that the way that he defines justice is exclusively a libertarian definition of justice?
Notice how you said the conservative manifesto. You are a leftist Christian anarchist.
No, that's what Peterson called it.
Right, and so, but did the ARC thing, the ARC website?
Peterson's
well,
Conservative
also-
Manifesto, his definition of justice was super libertarian and super focused on economics. That's just a fact.
Because he thinks that that's the way you get to human flourishing. And I know you have a difference with that, but that's how
The Bible has a difference with it.
That's how he wants to try and solve this issue that we see here.
All right. I think both of you have made your points.
By the way, I love Nate, and I know
I
he's
love
coming
Lance too.
Yeah. No, I know he's coming at this from a good place, and we are standing in two different places, and the two movies on one screen is playing out when Nate and I see things. Like I don't comment on Twitter about that stuff. I just for me personally.
Well, I got myself in it this time, Lance. But just really quickly, I would say that I would not describe myself as a leftist.
I know you wouldn't describe yourself as that.
I would not describe myself as a leftist, and I would say that in many ways my outlook is fundamentally conservative, and I would say more conservative than Jordan's.
I have a question for Nate and Lance. Jordan Peterson, when directly asked if he's Christian, refuses to give a yes or no answer, and he points to this thing of, Don't ask me what I am, look at how I act. So I want to ask Nate and Lance's opinion. Do you think he's a Christian from how he acts?
Do I? Absolutely.
I agree.
I hope that he doesn't. I agree with Chad on this. I hope he never declares his allegiance or states it, because that creates a whole bag of worms. I hope he just does it individually and personally between he and Tammy.
That would matter how he sees Jesus, right? Because the way he acts, I think
going all the way back to when he talked to Paul Vanderklay, Paul Vanderklay asked him a question, something about this. You have to listen very carefully to his words, and if you listen very carefully to any time that he ever touches closer to the line, he's clearly Christian. I mean, it's totally obvious, but he's also doing something that's very wise. I think he's trying. It's something that we try to do in 12-step programs. I don't want to give you the answer. I want you to find it, and I don't care what the answer is. I have my beliefs, and I don't want to pollute or lead the witness, so to speak. So I think that's what he's doing. I think very specifically, that's what he's doing. And he might, and if you like the rest of us Christians, you probably have a very an understanding that is ever evolving. And so I think, yes, he's very Christian, and I think he also is Christian in a very mystical way. And that's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. Hashtag social justice.
Just one
I would say that he's culturally Christian in a typically North American way.
Well,
and I think that he's wrestling, and I think that on a personal level that he's wrestling with Christ. And we'll see.
I would also want to point out on the economic front, like I did go to college in Minnesota, and there's a lot of social justice social democrats up there, and they come from your part of where you came from, Paul, over there in Europe. And in the day that had an economic element to it. Just because it has an economic element to it doesn't mean, because in the class, when I took that class, a lot of it was talking about trying to provide a way for people to move out of poverty into a life where they could flourish. Because there is an element, like, unless you don't know what it's like to pay your next bill, but how you're going to pay rent or how you're going to feed your family, like that's a level of pressure that if you can't get out of that, it's hard to do the other things of life.
And I can remember, like Lance, like I spent 20, like I told Paul earlier in this conversation, I spent 25 years of my life as a neocon. Like one of the angriest conversations I've ever had was I had an aunt who was very progressive, and I was, a standard neocon in those days. And what made me enraged is the assumption that I did not care about the poor because of my political beliefs. So I think that everyone needs to give the people that they disagree with the courtesy of having good intentions.
Which would include Jordan Peterson, right?
Which I absolutely, 100%.
So here's what I think he's actually up to.
I'm worried about the danger. I'm worried about the danger of the idea that authentic social justice does not exist mimetically catching on. That's why I said
it's
something.
Not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
I
think what he's actually doing is he's doing this thing where he kind of goes in with the pry bar to all of these presuppositions that people have, whether they're on the left or the right. He just wants to pry things up a little bit and like just shake things up enough to where each of us should be bothered by some of these questions. And I think, like, in the way that he kind of detests affirmation therapy, I think that's what he's kind of doing with all these strange things. You know, I don't think you're getting any real very deep and personal opinions from Jordan. Not often. I think you're getting some, but not a lot. And I noticed, like, when I went to see him last year, it was really strange. So he could do this thing. He would meet everybody at the end of the show. And what he would do is he'd have a very stoic face in between shaking hands with people. Just very plain face. So he'd take the picture and he'd have like this plain face. And then he'd like turn on a smile and he'd shake your hand. And then like 150 times he did this. And I thought, I don't know if we've ever seen anything really personal and genuine from Peterson, except for maybe when he's crying. I think that's very genuine. But mostly I think he's just going in there, he's trying to punch us up a little bit in the axioms, just to shake things up. If that means kind of tipping over the barrel of social justice so that we can pick it up and sort it out, I think it's fair enough. I don't know if that's a good assessment.
This, to me, sounds, and this was one of the questions that came in the first version of this when you were talking to Kale, Paul, but someone asked, is Jordan Peterson a prophet, in one of the questions, right? So I'm not saying he's a prophet, but hearing also Chad's explanation over here, the Bible, the prophets tell the kings that God never asked for these sacrifices. Ultimately, that's not what he asked for. So I agree that, Nate, that we should be steel manning the other person's position, and he should be looking at the Pope as good faith. But again, the way it came out, I think he's looking at that and saying that's not what's being required from us. Like, these are all fake versions of what we're calling social justice, and that's not what's requiring us from a society. However, I do think, Nate, that you articulated that very nicely at the end, that your fear, if I understand correctly, was due to his prominence, right? Someone's going to look at him sort of challenging the social justice from a biblical sense, and that's going to become mimetic. And I think that is a fair concern to have. And I think once you articulate it that way, I think a lot of people would have less issues with that specific criticism, because it's, the Pope shouldn't be saying that, but Jordan, you should have a lot more care with your words with regards to that.
Well,
attack.
And Hezi, I have that concern specifically because of the way, with Jordan ought to know this, right? Because Jordan talks about how the right goes wrong when it goes wrong. And I'm telling you, saying something like there is no authentic social justice, it's precisely the way to push the right into its worst version of itself. If that actually becomes a common way of thinking, it's just F social justice altogether. It was never real. We don't need to pay attention to it, and we can just silence our enemies. That's a problem. Because
but that's not. But in reality, that
feeds into the demons that the right is already prone to.
That's such a caricature. No one listen. That would seem to think that if you would think this, there's such a small percentage of people on both sides. When you go Antifa on one side and where you might have the hood wearers on the other side, those are just these little fringe elements. The massive amount of people, you know who they are? They're still the people that are going to church and maybe not doing it very well, but you know what? They absolutely believe in those elements. And so, and if you would look at who actually, who funds and actually puts their dollars behind contributions and giving portions of their money, the conservatives have always crush
debating that,
people on the
Lance.
left.
That is not what I'm
But
saying.
so the point that he somehow, you think he's mobilizing us to get rid of ideas of social justice?
Don't misunderstand me. That's not what I'm saying either.
Okay, I want to get some more voices in here.
Here, I'll leave so you can get more voices. By the way, Nate and Paul, great conversation.
Oh, thanks, Lance. Aaron and Anthony.
So it was interesting what Grizz said earlier about Jordan Peterson and the Church of the Internet, something like that. And interesting change that happens when a new means of communication comes along. So before the printing press arrives, the way that the church is structured and the Christian faith happens in a very particular form. After the printing press comes along, you have these religious wars across Europe. And now that we're in the era with, well, and I wasn't around, but I assume when the radio comes along, when TV comes along, all of a sudden there's weird or different forms of Christianity come along through these mediums. And now that we're on the internet, the way that communication happens and the language that people use is very particular and very different. And if you were, and I empathize with Nate that there's this very long tradition in the Catholic Church of social justice. But if you Google the word social justice, if you look on Wikipedia, which is kind of the internet's encyclopedia, it says social justice is terms of the distribution of wealth. And Peterson just kind of immediately goes to this Marxist thing, and he's not looking at that there is this long history. And you said a really interesting thing about that the idea that social justice isn't a thing or shouldn't be a thing catching on mimetically. But whatever this progressivism, wokeism, whatever you want to call it, has already mimetically co-opted the word social justice.
Absolutely.
If I hear that word at all these days, I don't think, besides in this very specific context, it's never a Catholic thing. I don't think 99% of the people who use the word social justice these days know it has a Catholic history. And that's where I'm seeing this mismatch in communication.
Yeah. And if that would have been where Peterson went, was just the initial reaction to the initial hashtag social justice with the initial things, I would have been okay with that. I wouldn't have. I mean, it raised my eyebrows a little bit, but I wouldn't have said anything on Twitter. It was really the second follow up where he's reacting to a conservative Catholic saying authentic social justice does not exist. That's the one I have a problem with.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Twitter is quite dementing and deranging it seems for anyone who uses it.
Right.
So yeah,
absolutely true. And also, like, you can, beyond your intent, like this is exactly what I fear, is that particular tweet, that authentic social justice does not exist, can have a life cycle far beyond what Peterson ever intended, and an intent far beyond what Peterson didn't intend. Because let me tell you something, the right is angry, and for good reason.
Yeah.
So maybe the best thing to do is not to feed the right's rage.
Oh yeah.
Because if that happens, then we're in for dark times. And I'm not it's not that I can't understand it. I understand how it's human, identify with it, but it could go bad places that Peterson does not intend, and that's my concern.
I think that comment is downstream from the term social justice having already changed its meaning in the popular culture.
That is absolutely correct. So what I would hope is that the conversation that could happen would be, how can we have a real conversation about authentic social justice? So rather than denying that authentic social justice exists, let's talk about the ways that the progressive version of social justice is neither social nor just. And how it fails on both tests.
This has been wonderful. I'm going to take my leave. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Great seeing you again. Aaron, I want to hear from Aaron.
I was just listening in the background. Thanks for the great talk. No, I was curious because you were talking about whether or not, if Peterson is a Christian in his actions, and I actually thought it's kind of strange and paradoxical because obviously he's been saying in the past that he wants to help as many individuals as he can. That's kind of his goal, it seems, in some ways. And yeah, just thinking about that, like, it's interesting that maybe he's considering that, even like that public image when he is discussing whether or not he is a Christian, that in actually admitting he'd be a Christian, you get that strange dynamic, which we sort of discussed earlier, that you'd lose maybe half his audience or something like that. So I'm curious what you like. So that kind of brought a question to mind, and I'm curious how you see that. So maybe, like, what if sort of professing the fact that you're a Christian will actually lead to you potentially doing less good in the world? And that's a strange paradox of this time, and maybe that's something he's thinking about. So that's just something that went through my mind while I was listening to you guys. I'm curious what you have to say.
I have a thought, because this will be my last thing. I think it is very evident from Peterson's communication that he has a high value for that spirit of voluntary play, that Piaget talks about, and that's the way that he approaches these things. And so he's very, very opposed to any sort of coercion. And, like, I kind of had this little meme kind of idea about a guy, like I called him Saint Couch Potato, which kind of is this guy who we would say he has the correct propositional understanding of salvation through the gospel, and he just sits there and does nothing. And I would say, even me would be tempted a lot of times I sat in my past to say, is that guy really a Christian? But then him just sitting there really drives a lot of self-righteous people nuts and is kind of accomplishing something for the kingdom.
Right.
But to contrast that too, I think that, and this is what I say, so that's the fear. That's the fear, is that we're going to get a bunch of Saint Couch Potatoes if we preach that gospel that easy way. But there's this really great clip out there. It's a conversation between Tim Keller and John Piper. And Tim Keller's talking about this woman in his church who's come to this knowledge of her salvation and realizing it's nothing that she's done. It's no effort of her own. It's totally a gift from God. And then she comes to this realization of saying, if I really understand that, if I really believe that, there's nothing that God can't ask me to do. Whereas if it's my merits of fulfilling some parameter of meeting my quota of social justice in the world, that's my effort and I've done it and I earn my spot. But if it's something that's totally undeserved, the reciprocal, voluntary, loving outpouring of works of grace is exponentially greater. And I think that's what we see in the lives of the great saints, Protestant and Catholic, is that these people have grasped a hold of the love of God in such a way, and it transforms them that it just overwhelms them. And creating a system where you're requiring or possibly could be seen as coercing behavior out of a people makes it more difficult for that rare, beautiful kind of conversion to happen. So that's my last bit.
Nice.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, the principle of non-coercion certainly appeals to the Christian anarchist side of my brain. But there. Oh, he left.
Too bad.
So, but I'm realizing that lately that it might be more complicated than that.
Your point, Aaron, I really like. I remember when I was last time I was going through the Sermon on the Mount, and I was thinking about chapter 6, where Jesus keeps telling people, "Don't do your righteousness before men," and I was thinking about how one of the real ironies about Jesus, and this isn't uncommon with saints through the history of the church, is that they don't necessarily have a good reputation with their contemporaries. And I think I think part of the cruciform way is that we are willing to sacrifice even our reputations. And I think for many of us, our reputations are, we value our reputations more than we value our money. We value our reputations more than we value truth. I mean, that's the whole idea behind a lie, is that we've tried to prop up our reputations at the expense of the truth. And so there is very much something, I think, in Jesus that leads us into, I remember there was a time in my life I was really trying to get a handle on my defensiveness, and I saw some things in Jesus and his teaching that led me to think that I should not justify myself. And you can find texts like that too, where let others justify you. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Peterson has an element of that with sort of when he talks about kind of this radical approach to truth telling, which, there's pitfalls in all these kinds of things always, but, speak the truth and let the chips fall where they may. I mean, that can fail the test of love sometimes as well. Speak the truth in love is also something, but I think there really is something in Jesus about, because he was crucified. People around could basically, mortal enemies, mortal political rivals could agree that the world is better without Jesus, and they had the political will to do it, and they didn't fear. There's this tension towards the end of the Gospels where they're trying to figure out exactly how they're going to arrest him, because they are a bit afraid of the mob in Jerusalem. But once they overcome that, it's like, all right, now we got him. Now we can kill him. And I think that's part of the Christian life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm curious, because he wants to keep talking to Muslims who want him to convert to Islam, he wants to do that. He doesn't just want to be this sort of, I don't know, closed down for them. So very interesting.
No.
Yeah.
The one point I was also going to make about Twitter is when, we're talking about AI, and I think, Nate, you were participating in an AI conversation the other day too on one of these channels.
Yeah.
We're not talking to the Pope. In a sense, there's a body that has a Twitter account.
Yeah,
that
it's
is
definitely not the Pope.
tweeting in the name of the Pope.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's almost an AI. It's not exactly it's not artificial in the sense that it's sort of further downstream like these natural language engines. But, the one conversation that Peterson had with Andrew Scholes, that comedian, where people are looking at, the atmosphere in the room, and Sam brought this point up in my conversation with Kale too. I think that's an issue in this too, where I think if Elon wanted to do something with Twitter, it could be, only real people get to tweet, not bodies and surrogates and these sorts of things. That could, in fact, perhaps improve Twitter. I don't know. So I thought that was a point I wanted to make in this.
Yeah. Good point.
All right, have we beat this horse to death?
I think so.
Is it time to land the plane?
That's good. Yeah.
Sounds good, Paul.
Thanks for jumping in, Aaron. Thank all the rest of you who jumped on. Thank you so much, Nate, for giving us your time.
Anytime, Paul. It was good to get a chance to talk to you without a intermediary for a while.
No, me too. I loved it. So, all right. Thank you all.
All right. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.